decay, but currently it is in decay. And then finally, it speaks about the entire physical universe coming to an end. I believe God's going to bring it to an end a lot sooner than science says it will come to an end. Next slide. As we look at these, the universe designed for life, and we look at these features, 140, this is as of 2006, and you can see the progression here, going from 17 in 1991 to over 140 now of things that have to be fine-tuned in order to permit life on the planet. I'm just going to show you one of these. Next slide, please. It's a dime, okay? And if you look at this dime, it's very light. And actually, if you were to add the mass of a dime or subtract the mass of a dime from the mass of the universe early on in its history, life would be impossible at any point in the history of the universe. If you added the mass of a dime, it would collapse back on itself before anything interesting happened, before you got stars, galaxies, planets, etc. And if you took away the mass of a dime, it would expand too quickly, and you wouldn't get the clumping of matter that's necessary to form galaxies, stars, planets, etc. So this is just one element that's fine-tuned within 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. So, and this is just one aspect. And again, this is conceded by the scientific community as being fine-tuned to that extent. As Paul Davies says, it seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers. The impression of design is overwhelming. The universe must have a purpose. Next slide, please. And as we look at a planet designed for life, we have, again, you see the progression and characteristics. Next slide. And if you're talking about getting humans being able to exist in a planet, the parameters are far greater. And look at those probabilities. 10 minus 10 to the minus 1,032 if you multiply out the probabilities of getting each of these things. And we're very conservative in the probabilities we use. And we just showed you that you couldn't even get 50 Yahtzees in the history of the universe. I'm willing to concede all the materials. You just can't roll the dice enough to get a planet like ours that'd be that unique. Next slide, please. And this is this lucky accident I think Jane talked about a little bit, where you get this collider with the Earth, roughly the size of Mars, early in the Earth's formation. And it was a perfect collision in that it gave the Earth just the right mass so that we could have a stable water cycle. One of the things that's important is if the Earth was just a little bit lighter, the water in the atmosphere would dissipate onto the atmosphere. We'd look more like Mars. If the Earth was a little heavier, we would hold in the ammonia and the methane in the atmosphere. We'd look more like Venus, or look more like one of the gas giants, probably is a better example. It gave us just the right materials for tectonics to work. It slowed the rotation down, so you think your days are not long enough now. How about a 6-hour day? How would that work for you? Not to mention you'd be dealing with some very strong wind speeds if we had a 6-hour day. So it slowed the rotation to an ideal 24 hours. And that is very ideal. You can't go much more one way or the other without severely limiting life on the planet. And it stabilized its axis tilt at roughly 23.5 degrees. If the Earth did a lot of wobbling, it'd be tough to sustain civilization in a particular region for a long period of time. There's up to 20 different things that the moon gave us that are absolutely necessary. And there are plenty of great shows, you can see on the Discovery Channel or Science Channel that will show you these things. Now, again, they try to always put this into an evolutionary paradigm, or most of the times they try to frame it there. But there's no need. Again, the evidence is there. Conclusions are up to the observer. Next slide, please. Again, we have some books that really deal with these issues in detail. You can stop by the table and we can talk about those. And I'm going to skip the Q&A right now because I know we're getting a little short on time. And the next 3 sections I'd like to break out are dealing with life, the origin of life, the fossil record, and human origins. And again, Jane touched on this a bit. Life appears under hostile conditions, and there's no evidence for primordial soup. Next slide, please. You can just skip the quote. And when we talk about biological evolution, again, it's this idea that life's diversity results solely from undirected transformations of one original forms. Again, Jane touched on this quite a bit. And we really have 3 different areas where the evolutionary community can do testing. They can test the fossil record, they can test genetics, and they can test morphology, which is the body structure, and see if there's a connection. If their paradigm is correct, they should see okay, this whale resembles a whale, and genetically, this creature, where they put their order in the fossil record, it should resemble genetically, it should resemble in morphology. But what do we find? Well, here's an example of what I call whale phylogenies failures. And again, phylogenies are evolutionary pathways. In the fossil record, the whale looks like it evolved more from some wolf-like creature, but genetically, it's more closely related to the hippo. But morphology-wise, it's more closely related to the pig. And we continually find these inconsistencies in the fossil record. And I think that really presents a problem from their paradigm. We can move on. And one of the things that's pointed out in the evolutionary literature is this idea of repeated evolution. This should never happen this should never happen where you have repeated evolution, where you have the same occurrence happening in more than one place. Because everything is strictly a random chance. And the things that happen to be able to survive lasted. So you should never see the same type of creatures independent of each other, or even the same functionality apparent. You can go to the next slide. These are all examples of repeated evolution. And the next slide, here's some examples of what they call ranid frogs. And what's interesting about these frogs, they found these frogs, these tree frogs and burrowing frogs, that were indistinguishable from each other. Some are in Madagascar, and some of them are in India. And they're indistinguishable. They can't find any difference. Well, what happened is when they did DNA, what they expected to find was that the tree frogs evolved from one tree frog and the burrowing frogs evolved from one burrowing frog. What they found was actually the tree and burrowing frogs in India were more closely related genetically, and the tree and India frogs in Madagascar were more closely related genetically. And they concluded that they did not evolve in one place, but that they basically evolved separately on their different areas. Well, this is a real problem. How do you get these virtually identical frogs on these different continents with no genetic connection whatsoever? So this, again, becomes a problem for the paradigm. We saw some big probabilities earlier, but now you get even a bigger problem with these probabilities. When you're looking at less than 1 chance in 10 to the million, or less than 1 chance in 10 to the 24 million of these things happening, of probability of getting bacteria to evolve into humans. I mean, 10 to the minus 100 is enough to say it's never going to happen. We're looking at 10 to the minus 24 million in extreme. I've even seen of getting even the simplest single life form, just to get the original life form, I've seen probabilities in the area of 10 to the minus 100 billion. All the things that have to come together mathematically. So you can even give the scientists all the primordial soup they want, even though we have no evidence of it, and you're simply the probability. I would say it's a mathematical absurdity to think these things can happen by chance. And I'll go out on a limb and say that. Next slide, please. And of course, this is what most of us want to talk about, is this primitive creature on the left evolving into this large, upright creature on the right. And next slide, please. And as Jane talked about, we have a biblical date for the creation of Adam and Eve at roughly 50,000 years ago, plus or minus 20,000 years. Next slide, please. And one of the things, again, that's interesting is you see this explosion of spirit expression taking place at roughly the same time, about 40,000 years ago. You see, all of a sudden, you see language, jewelry, clothing, tools, art, all these things you start to see. Matter of fact, you see about 10 times the amount of jewelry as you see tools back then in the fossil record, which I think proportionally is probably still the same today. Next slide. And all these bipedal primates, as we like to call them, that predated humans, they've been all proven to not have any genetic link to the human species. Again, this is, humans are not a creature that was one of these, Neanderthal, for example, and then God said, okay, I'm going to give them a spirit. No, there's no genetic connection whatsoever. And matter of fact, I remember first reading about 15 years ago when they finally were able to extract DNA from a Neanderthal, and their conclusion, these are people who are looking for an evolutionary connection. And their conclusion is not only are we not descendant from Neanderthals, we have no common ancestors. So to me, that's a pretty significant conclusion coming from people who wanted a connection. And next slide. So what's the conclusion of this all? For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. God has given enough evidence for his existence, for his creation. And that's why I like those 6 areas. Those are 6 areas I can depend on where the scientific evidence shows divine intervention. The origin of the universe, the design and the laws of physics, the Earth, Sun, Moon system, the origin of life, the fossil record, and humanity, all show evidence of God's divine handiwork. And again, we have some materials that'll help you with that. So I think we're going to end this session now.